And while he's doing that, let me introduce Simon Clarke. He leads the supply chain practice at Argon and Co., a leading management consultancy specializing in supply chain transformation. He also serves, along with me and Stefan Kalasa, as associate editors of Foresight, the International Journal of Applied Forecasting. Simon previously led the Forecast Center of Excellence within Coca-Cola Refreshments. He was responsible for forecasting volume and revenue in North America. He was also part of the Coca-Cola Enterprises team that designed and implemented a single collaborative forecasting process and toolset in 26 divisions, which had previously operated autonomously. Simon hails from the United Kingdom, as you might suspect, but has lived in Atlanta, Georgia now for almost 20 years. And Simon received his degree from Grey College, Durham University. Welcome, Simon.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me all loud and clearly.
Yep.
Just to kind of re-emphasize a little bit about my background, I'm a practitioner at heart, but I've become a coach over the last couple of years, having got into kind of consulting with Argon and Co. So I think I feel like I kind of know some of the realities of what it's like to actually kind of execute some of the processes I coach people on today. Today, what I'd like to do with you is explore the concept of one number forecasting and the merits and practicality of aligning around a single forecast number in an organization. There's been a lot of kind of focus around this over the last probably 10 or 15 years. And what I'd like to do is kind of share some thoughts on whether we could realistically expect to align on a single number. I think before we do that, I think it's important to kind of first kind of put the concept in context, particularly around organizational designs. So in most organizations, there's one form or fashion of organizational design that's implemented. The traditional one that you'll find is a functional organizational structure, where different entities all align themselves around types of work. So you know, a marketing organization might be grouped together, a sales organization may be grouped together, a finance organization, and so on. But there are other ways to organize as well. They might have more of a product-based approach, more of a market-based approach, or even a geographical-based approach. But all of those structures can suffer from silos of knowledge and insight. So in nearly all organizations that we go into, you find that there are some sort of organizational barriers that sit between different areas. And there are some organizational designs that are built around trying to break down some of those silos. So you'll hear many people talk about matrixed organizations, where there's almost like virtual teams. But even in those situations, you can find that silos of knowledge and insight are kind of manifest. So in each of those functions, a very traditional functional organization, maybe your sales organization is asking the questions about what's going to be sold, how do I profitably grow my business? Whereas in finance, maybe they're asking, what's the financial impact? What are my costs, revenue and profit implications? And in a supply chain organization, it might be as simple as what do I need to buy, make, or move? So there are different kind of questions that are being asked. And there are different kind of barriers to the exchange of information across those. So what we call functional silos. So what are the kind of benefits and kind of challenges of some of those organizational designs? Well, obviously, if you have a functional organizational design, it kind of creates operational efficiency through the sharing of resources. So you have a greater scale and a greater pool of resources to be able to apply against a problem or a process. It also, a functional organizational design gives you the opportunity to kind of build concentrated pools of expertise or talents. So as an example, in kind of a COVID context, you know, teams working on vaccines are working together, typically organized around expertise in a specific area. So you're pooling all the relevant knowledge into a specific area to address a very specific problem. And it's very effective at doing that. It also kind of has the benefit of increasing the speed to recognize issues and respond, and it provides that kind of singular focus on a functional area, and there's less distraction because you're very much focused on a single problem or solution. The downside of that is that it can however create these kind of functional ethos, a functional tribe, a culture that can be sometimes suspicious of outsiders. It can be suspicious of different ways of working or approaching problems, and can also promote poor exchange of information and collaboration amongst those process participants. And probably worst of all is it can create kind of political jockeying for resources and influence. So you kind of create some unintended consequences from very specialized kind of logical grouping of work. So I think it's probably worth kind of understanding why that's relevant to kind of forecasting. Well, if you think about good forecasting processes are reliant on good flow of information. And what we find with functional siloed organization is that information flow doesn't work effectively. It often gets pooled in various places and doesn't get disseminated through the organization. Functional organizations also can tend to politicize the kind of forecast process as well. Not necessarily everybody's intentions are pure as they're working on problems, and there may be just mindset, functional mindset bias that kind of sits in between a demand and a supply organization, and clearly the benefits don't necessarily always shared equally amongst an organization. So there can be some, it can be kind of unclear as to why people are involved in certain activities and processes. So functional silos, in simple terms, is bad news for forecasting. And forecasting, as we all know, is kind of really dependent on two things. It's not just dependent on data. There's a certain amount that you can accomplish by just having good pools of historic data, past precedent to be able to plan for the future. But there's also a kind of a key requirement to kind of have information and context to the data that you're looking at. So having that good kind of quality data as well as information is absolutely critical. So, a classic example being an outlier. You may have a piece of data in your historical data set that you have no good reason for just looking at data for what's driving that. Information is critical to understand it. So having barriers or challenges in the flow of context and information across different functional areas or different organizational structures is a real impediment to forecasting. So the other thing I would just kind of like highlight here as well is that different functional areas can be kind of very politicized. So a classic example here is kind of people's orientation towards growth and mindset. So typically what you find on the demand side of an organization, on the growth side of an organization, is an orientation, a positive orientation. So in marketing terms, part of the kind of benefit of that kind of positive mindset is, being able to project growth helps them attract additional investment. So it's like a virtuous circle of positivity. The more confidence they project into the future, typically the more willing people are to invest in those particular areas. The same applies in sales, although perhaps through a slightly different lens. Their positive mindset is more about kind of motivating others to maintain continuity of supply. So you have this classic positive bias from sales organizations, where it's partly through mindset that they're kind of oriented towards growth, but partly because they're politicizing the process and trying to ensure that there is kind of a continuity of supply that's acknowledged in the supply side processes. Counterbalancing that in organizations, typically you find finance organizations are more more cautious and more restrained and in managing kind of internal and external expectations. So for publicly listed organizations, they're managing not just internal stakeholders, but also investment communities and external stakeholder groups. So they typically tend to be more cautious, more risk averse than kind of your demand side organizations. And then finally, you have supply chain organizations who typically have balance sheet responsibility for kind of obsolescence, inventory, operating expense. And they tend to be thinking about things about how do I minimize cost rather than how do I orientate myself towards growth. So you have these forecasting kind of powers that are at work inside organizations that kind of can affect the quality of forecasts that are kind of being created. So where did the concept of one number forecasting kind of come from? So, you know, with all that kind of context, you know, the 1970s were a tumultuous time, as many people who were present at that time were kind of aware of. There was oil crisis, there was stagflation, there was kind of an existential threat to many organizations, and it forced them to kind of rethink how they operated. And you know, one of the first organizations to start thinking about this was Abbott Laboratories, and they started a process that they called game planning that encouraged different functions to take the perspective of others and kind of work together to kind of come up with aligned plans kind of going forward. That kind of evolved as kind of Michael and Patrick were describing over time into structures and approaches and processes to align around consistent views of the business and really kind of tackle some of those functional silos and business performance. And they decided that kind of one way to tackle this was kind of get people to align around a single number forecast. The idea being that if you can bring together everybody in those different functional areas with different mindset biases and different political kind of, political biases, you could arrive at a better forecast by doing that. And some of the processes and structures to formalize that process of arriving at a one number forecast came through things like sales and operations planning that Patrick described previously. And also, and that's kind of more of an internal process, but also there were external processes that were developed, CPFR, so collaborative planning, forecasting and replenishment, that was kind of pushed by VIX in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, was kind of more of an external manifestation of that desire to get folks to align around agreed on plans, agreed on forecasts that everybody could fall behind and kind of eliminate some of those kind of functional biases. And really the kind of concept behind that is conceptually really quite appealing, that there's no reason I can think of why people, you know, it's not an appealing kind of concept. Because on face value, it's an intuitive response to the problem, because it forces alignment of goals and objectives from groups who have different viewpoints. It promotes kind of collaboration, openness and trust, creates a single forecast for the organization to get right. So, you know, with all these kind of different kind of tensions within an organization, having a single number seems like an intuitive thing to do to get the organization aligned behind a single number and drive focus on delivering the plan. The second kind of reason why it's kind of conceptually appealing is it improves or creates kind of focus for the organization, increases scrutiny, it puts kind of all the eggs in a single basket, and eliminates those kind of tribal war stories that tend to have kind of the ability to gain legs within an organization and prevail over facts. And finally, kind of minimizes the opportunity for games playing and hedging. So if you only have one number, well, the opportunity to play games with it and kind of hedge and sandbag and politicize it go away, because you only really have kind of one number, which is part of the game. And finally, it kind of helps increase kind of coordination between demand and supply sides of the organization, because we're working off a single number that everybody can kind of get behind. So conceptually, the idea of one number forecasting is really kind of appealing. And it's kind of why many of the consulting organizations pushed it quite heavily in the 90s and thousands. As kind of like the ideal state. You want to get everybody aligned behind a single number. But what I'm going to suggest is that that's somewhat old-fashioned thinking, and I think there's good reasons why that is not such a good idea. And part of that is evidence-based. So there are plenty of kind of studies out there now that are quite striking in what they're telling us. They're telling us really that forecast error hasn't changed over time. And this is despite many organizations implementing sales and operations planning, aligning organizations around single numbers. There hasn't been a material improvement in accuracy as a result of kind of this effort to kind of align the efforts of the organization. What it doesn't tell us is what efficiencies have been kind of created by aligning around a single number, but certainly from a metric perspective, there's no evidence to suggest that a single number approach is yielding dividend. And from our own research in my organization at Argon and Co, where we do process maturity assessments, where we've sampled over 200 organizations around the world, we found that there's a stunning lack of maturity still in terms of forecast process maturity. In fact, we find that probably less than 15% of companies that we've interviewed have processes that we would regard as being proficient or having some degree of mastery over, which suggests that for all the effort that we put into aligning around a single number forecast, it hasn't yielded either results or improvements in process maturity and the kind of quality of kind of how the process is being organized and run. So the evidence is there that one number forecasting isn't working. And I think there are kind of three kind of reasons why there've been kind of barriers to this improvement. One is the purpose. I think one thing to reflect on is that in a single number forecasting process, there's kind of an assumption that the purpose of all the participants in creating a forecast is the same across the same horizon. And I'll go into elaborate on that in a little bit more detail shortly. But I think it's fair to say that the purpose of different participating forecast participants isn't the same. And I think the second kind of thing that we find is kind of been a barrier to kind of improvement is that a single number approach typically results in what we would call horse trading, which quite honestly has very, very little to do with arriving at a most accurate forecast, and has a little more to do with just getting people to a place where they don't object to a number. So it's more about the process of consensus building, is about really kind of getting everybody to a place where they don't love it, but they also don't completely object to it, which has nothing to do with arriving at a more accurate forecast. And the final kind of part of this, from a process perspective, is the process of aligning people around a single number actually kind of promotes one of the things that we wouldn't want to see in a forecasting process, which is getting everybody to get into kind of a groupthink mentality around what they think is going to happen. So, perspective that sits out kind of a narrow range of conventional thinking is rejected. It's kind of assumed it just can't possibly happen. So the kind of process actually of single number forecasting actually drives a kind of a negative effect on the forecast. And I think the final kind of part of it is more of a technology-based conversation, which is, whilst it's a lot easier to kind of arrive at a single number forecast because it's kind of reduces complexity. That's kind of partly being driven by kind of limited tech capability in technology that we've had in the past to be able to store data at different levels of aggregation reconciled data, perhaps on different temporal hierarchical levels, and kind of in different time buckets. So there's been kind of more of a technical challenge to kind of doing anything other than kind of one number forecasting. So those have kind of been key barriers that we've seen. I think that the fundamental problems with one number forecasting was also around aggregation. There's kind of an assumption that different functional areas have different same methods to create a forecast. If I'm in supply chain, a logical way for me to create a forecast is to build it bottom up, so potentially by SKU or location. If I'm sitting in finance, that really isn't really what my purpose is in creating a forecast. Typically, I want to create a forecast top down that might be more geographically focused, more territorially focused, and more at a kind of a higher level of aggregation on the product hierarchy. So maybe more about a product family. Whereas a sales and marketing organization might be more interested in kind of a middle through view. If you think about that, that means the method by which a different functional group might want to create a forecast is different by different area. So you've got these kind of mismatches of method, which is problematic. I think the other kind of problem is temporal demands are different also by different functional groups. The supply chain group is typically more interested in more granular level of detail, so perhaps days or weeks. A finance organization might be more worried about months and quarters, and the sales marketing might be aligned by months and quarters, but may be interested more in kind of long term, trying to understand where customers and consumers are heading. So there are different temporal demands that make aligning around a single number very challenging. And of course, then the basic data outputs are therefore different as well. So a supply chain organization might be more interested in physical units of cases, units, or eaches, and interested in shipment demand. So what am I actually shipping to a customer? Whereas a finance organization might be interested in what's my revenue? So what do my invoices look like as opposed to my shipments, which could be two different things. And they may be more focused around dollars or revenue or units of measure. Or a sales organization might be more focused on the customer or consumer. So they may be more interested in consumption data, like point of sale information or pull through. And that may be typically captured at that point of sale as well. So you've got these different kind of need states that are reflected in forecasts in an organization. So the idea of everybody aligning around a single forecasting number is somewhat improbable. It's somewhat difficult to actually accomplish, and perhaps isn't the right thing anyway because of those different horizons, product details, units of measure, time buckets. So what's the alternative? And I think the alternative is to align around an aligned set of forecasts rather than a single number approach. So instead of forcing everybody to consensus or forcing everybody to compromise what they need from the process, I think it strikes me that it makes a lot more sense to have an aligned set of forecasts that are consistent by dimension. So, time, product, geography, and customer, perhaps, have them all consistent around by hierarchy, but don't force them to all be the same number. So the idea is that it kind of embraces the diversity that different functional areas bring to the forecasting process. It emphasizes the need to understand and not eliminate different points of view. And it makes I think the other kind of feature is, and concept around this is to make sure that all the forecasts are transparent. So rather than kind of like mashing them all together and bringing kind of, an opaque view to different points of view, is provide visibility to those different points of view and allow them to thrive and allow them to be used in the context in which they've been designed for. And finally, just kind of avoid forcing organizations to kind of align behind a single number that nobody is fully committed to. In this model, everybody can be fully committed to their own numbers and not forced to compromise where it doesn't make sense.
Hey, Simon, we've got about 3.5 minutes left.
Okay, let me wrap this up. So I think the kind of the key summary here is the forecasting process shouldn't be the sledgehammer to address functional silos. What's important is that different functional groups should be connected through the process by bringing visibility to the different perspectives. It is enabled by hierarchy design. So this concept of having a set of aligned forecasts has to be aligned by good hierarchy design that works for enables kind of reconciliation. I think the challenges, I think, for technology vendors is to kind of enable the capability to capture multiple independent forecasts. Many of those don't do that right now, and I think that's the challenge for software vendors right now, is to figure out how to capture different independent forecasts and provide visibility. And then I think if you have to align because there isn't the supporting technology doesn't enable it, is where a single point forecast is required, make sure the method of arriving at that single number is empirically driven, whether it's driven by accuracy or by bias, but have a conscious method of combining forecasts into a single point forecast. So thank you very much for kind of listening. I wonder if there are any kind of questions or things that are on people's mind.
Hey, Simon, we've got one from Carolyn Allman. In your recent experience, how many companies still strive for one number?
It's a pretty good number, actually. In many organizations that I go to, folks who are driving them to a sales and operations planning process drive them towards single number forecasts I think it's to simplify that process. So I still think there are a lot of people who are driving towards a single number. I think people are beginning to kind of acknowledge the fact that perhaps a single number doesn't work for everybody, and you know there are different ways of kind of approaching it. But I think S&OP is kind of fortunately, unfortunately, still drives a lot of organizations to work towards a single number, thinking that's the kind of the way to drive out some of those functional, you know, those barriers driven by functional silos.
Great. Hey, and Nikos, last question before we have to go over to the keynote, but Nikos.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the talk. You may know that I'm a big fan of reconciliation approaches, temporal or sectional. But I'm getting a bit from your talk the idea that the question is not really about the one number forecast, but it's about forecasts and plans, that the different functions have different requirements and therefore different plans and targets, whereas still we need some sort of consensus information that everybody plans on. Am I getting that correctly, or what's your comment on that?
Yeah, I would say that everybody, I think where you have to have a single number is around a plan or a budget. I think that's kind of like the single kind of true north for an organization. But I think it's important to have different perspectives on how you're progressing against that plan or budget. I don't think it makes sense that you have different budgets, but I think it's important you have different perspective, different trajectories on the trajectory of the business. Let's put it like that.
Hey, sorry, we've got to cut off here. The keynotes will be starting in a moment. So Simon, thank you very much. Patrick, thank you very much. And we'll see you all a little bit later. Bye-bye.